Quinoa is marketed as the perfect grain, complete protein, all 9 essential amino acids, a superfood for the modern health-conscious eater. And yes, the research supports most of what is claimed about it. But there is a grain that fed the population of ancient Israel for over 3,000 years. A grain that sustained shepherds, soldiers, prophets, and kings. A grain that Jesus himself almost certainly ate at nearly every meal for his entire earthly life. And when you look at the actual nutritional comparison, not the marketing, that grain delivers roughly 2 times the usable protein of quinoa on a gram-for-gram basis. It was cheap, it was local, it was humble, and it has been nearly erased from the modern Western plate. Its name, in Hebrew, was kusamet. In Latin, triticum dicoccum. In modern kitchens where it has quietly survived, it goes by the name farro, or sometimes by its older name, emmer wheat. Picture the scene for a moment. A sloping Galilean hillside in late spring, the air warm, but still carrying a trace of the early morning cool off the lake. The heads of the grain have turned from green to a dry, burnished gold, and they bend slightly in the breeze, heavy with kernels. A family has been out since dawn, cutting handfuls with sickles made of iron set into olive wood handles. Children follow behind, gathering what falls. The cut stalks are bundled, carried down to a flat circle of packed earth at the edge of the village, and there, on the threshing floor, the work of separation begins. An ox is walked in slow circles over the stalks, sometimes dragging a wooden sled weighted with stones. The hulls crack, the kernels fall free. Then, when the wind picks up in the late afternoon, the workers take up wooden forks and toss the mixture into the air. The chaff drifts off on the breeze. The heavier grain falls back to the floor. This is the winnowing. It is the image Scripture returns to again and again, and it is how the grain that would become the day's bread was cleaned for thousands of years. From there, the kernels went to the grinding stone, a pair of heavy rounded stones turned by hand, one above the other, with the grain fed between them. The flour that emerged was coarse, flecked with bran, alive with the germs still intact. This was the raw material of daily life. Let me be specific about what emmer is, because confusion on this point is widespread. Modern bread wheat, the stuff you find in nearly every supermarket loaf, is a relatively recent hybrid. It was developed and stabilized largely over the past 2 centuries, bred for yield, shelf stability, and ease of processing. Modern bread wheat is a hexaploid grain with 42 chromosomes arranged on 6 sets, the product of ancient cross-hybridizations layered on top of aggressive modern selection. Emmer is not that wheat. Emmer is a tetraploid with 28 chromosomes, one of the original domesticated grains of the Fertile Crescent, grown by the populations of ancient Egypt, Canaan, and later Judea for at least 9,000 years. It has a different protein structure, a hardier hull, a taller stalk, and a substantially different nutritional profile. The difference matters. In the mid-20th century, the agronomist Norman Borlaug and his colleagues launched what came to be called the Green Revolution, developing short, stiff-stemmed dwarf wheat varieties that could absorb high doses of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer without falling over, and that yielded 2 to 3 times the harvest per acre of traditional wheats. This technology saved lives in real ways. It also transformed the grain itself. The dwarf wheat that now dominates the global food supply has a gluten network engineered for industrial bakeries and a nutritional profile shaped by high-input monoculture. When Scripture references wheat in the context of daily bread, when Ezekiel, in chapter 4, lists the grains combined for a specific bread, when the Gospels describe the breaking of bread during Passover, the grain underneath those references is overwhelmingly likely to have been emmer, barley, or a blend of both. Modern bread wheat as we know it did not yet exist. The numbers are what matter. Quinoa, cooked, delivers approximately 4 grams of protein per 100 grams. Emmer, cooked, delivers roughly 7 to 8 grams of protein per 100 grams. Raw, the gap widens further. Quinoa sits around 14 grams of protein per 100 grams of dry seed. Emma ranges from 15 to 18 grams per 100 grams of dry grain, with some varieties reaching close to 20. On usable protein, once you account for digestibility and amino acid availability, research suggests Emma provides roughly double the protein per serving size someone would actually eat. Now the counterpoint, honestly, quinoa has a better lysine profile, which is often cited as what makes it a complete protein while wheat is technically incomplete. That is a fair point, but it misses how ancient people ate. They never ate grain alone. Emma was always paired with lentils, chickpeas, or a small amount of dairy in the same meal. The lentil and bread combination, which appears repeatedly throughout scripture, produces a complete amino acid profile, with superior total protein content to quinoa served by itself. The ancients did not know amino acid theory. They knew meals, and their meals worked. There is a specific verse worth lingering on. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 4, verse 9, the prophet is given a recipe by God that has become one of the most studied bread formulations in nutritional archaeology. Take also unto thee wheat and barley and beans and lentils and millet and spelt, and put them in one vessel, and make thee bread thereof. 6 ingredients, 3 grains and 3 legumes. When modern food scientists have analyzed this combination, they have found that it produces what is essentially a perfect plant protein profile, with all 9 essential amino acids present, in excellent ratios, comparable to animal protein on most measures. The spelt in older translations is most likely what we now call Emma, closely related and often interchanged in ancient texts. And this recipe was not an abstract teaching. It was given as a literal instruction for a man who was about to go through a long period of hardship and needed a single food that could sustain him. The prescription was divine. The nutritional science was, in hindsight, exact. Let me speak now to what modern research has specifically documented about Emma wheat, because the list of bioactive compounds in this grain is far richer than most people realize. A 2013 study in the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry analyzed the antioxidant content of Emma compared to modern bread wheat, and found Emma contained significantly higher concentrations of beneficial polyphenols, carotenoids, and selenium, much of it bound as selenomethionine, a form the human body absorbs efficiently. A 2018 review in the journal Nutrients noted that Emma has a lower glycemic index than modern wheat, meaning it raises blood sugar more slowly. A 2019 paper in Food Research International reported that Emma retains more intact gluten proteins, of a kind that some research suggests may be more tolerable for people with mild wheat sensitivities, though it is not gluten-free and is not appropriate for anyone with celiac disease. A 2017 study in Cereal Chemistry measured the essential amino acid content of Emma and found levels of methionine and cysteine notably higher than modern wheat, with lysine comparable. A 2020 analysis in the Journal of Cereal Science documented unusually high concentrations of alkyl resorcinols in the bran layer of Emma, phenolic lipids that have been associated in epidemiological research with the beneficial effects of whole grain consumption. A 2016 paper in Food Research International measured ferulic acid, a cell wall-bound antioxidant, at levels substantially higher in Emma than in modern hexaploid wheat, and also quantified the lignin content, including secoisolaricyresinol, a plant compound that gut bacteria convert into mammalian lignins associated with hormonal balance in long-term population studies. Emma also carries meaningful amounts of tocotrienols, a rarer form of vitamin E found primarily in the germ, and which research suggests may support cardiovascular and cellular health. What ancient people understood intuitively, we are now able to name molecularly. The grain was not just food, it was a complete structural nutrient. The preparation matters as much as the grain itself. Ancient Judean bread making followed a specific and slow process. The Emma was harvested by hand in late spring, typically around the Feast of Weeks. The grains were then threshed to release the kernel from the hull, and then winnowed, tossed in the wind to separate the light chaff from the heavier grain. Because Emma has a particularly stubborn hull, This step took more work than modern wheat requires, and it is part of the reason emmer fell out of favor in industrial agriculture. Once cleaned, the grain was ground, sometimes coarsely, sometimes fine, on a stone mill. The flour produced was never uniform. It retained bran and germ, and crucially, the bread was almost always leavened with natural sourdough rather than commercial yeast, which was of course not available. A small piece of dough was kept from the previous day's batch, mixed into the new flour and water, and allowed to ferment. That long fermentation is where something remarkable happens chemically. The wild lactic acid bacteria and wild yeasts present in a mature sourdough starter produce enzymes called phytases, which cleave phytic acid, a compound in whole grains that otherwise binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium and blocks their absorption. When phytic acid is broken down, those minerals become substantially more bioavailable. At the same time, the bacteria secrete proteases that partially break down gluten proteins, which is why many people who feel uncomfortable after eating commercial bread can tolerate a long-fermented sourdough loaf without the same reaction. The fermentation also produces organic acids that lower the bread's glycemic response and develop flavor compounds that commercial yeast cannot replicate. Modern research from Italian and Turkish cereal science laboratories has confirmed that sourdough fermentation of emmer flour produces a bread substantially more digestible than commercial wheat bread, with meaningful increases in mineral availability. Another ancient step that turned out to be exactly right. Here is what the bread would have looked like on an ordinary table in 1st century Galilee. Round, flat, often no thicker than ½ inch. A slightly nutty, earthy aroma. A tan to brown color depending on the harvest and grind. A chewy, slightly dense texture. It tore rather than cut. It was eaten with olive oil, sometimes dipped in salt, often accompanied by a bowl of lentils or chickpeas and a few olives. A small amount of goat cheese might appear. Occasionally fish, rarely meat. The meal was simple. It was sustaining. And it delivered what we now recognize as an excellent macronutrient balance, with steady release carbohydrate, complete combined protein, healthy fat from the olive oil, and a meaningful mineral load from the whole grain. The combination also delivered a broad spectrum of the named compounds we have been discussing. The emmer supplied alkyl resorcinols, ferulic acid, secoisolaricyresinol, tocotrienols, and selenomethionine. The olive oil supplied oleocanthal and squalene. The lentils supplied additional lysine, polyphenols, and soluble fiber. The result was a table that, by modern measurement, stacks up well against anything a 21st century nutritionist would design from scratch. Why did this grain disappear from most of the world? The answer is industrial economics. Emmer has a tough hull that makes large-scale milling slow and expensive. It yields less per acre than modern hybrid wheat. It has a long stalk that lodges in heavy rain and cannot absorb synthetic fertilizer the way dwarf varieties can. It does not bake into the soft, pale, fluffy white bread that became culturally preferred in the 20th century. By the time the Green Revolution scaled up wheat production globally, emmer had been pushed into near oblivion, preserved only in a few isolated regions of Italy, Ethiopia, and the Caucasus, where tradition and terrain protected it. In the past 2 decades, as interest in ancient grains has grown, it has returned to specialty markets under the Italian name farro. But the word farro is generic. In Italy, it covers 3 related ancient wheats, each called by a different farro label. Farro piccolo is einkorn, a diploid grain with 14 chromosomes and the oldest of the wheats. Farro medio is emmer, the grain we are discussing. Farro grande is spelt, a later hexaploid, closer in chromosome structure to modern wheat. All 3 are nutritious ancient grains. Only emmer is the specific grain of biblical Israel. If you want the exact grain Jesus ate, you have to read the label carefully and buy from specialty grain sources. When the label specifies emmer or triticum dicoccum or farro medio, you have the real thing. If it says spelt or triticum spelta, you have a relative, excellent in its own right, but not the biblical grain. If it says einkorn or triticum monococcum, same story. Generic farro with no species named could be any of the three. Let me give you the practical preparation, because emmer can enter your kitchen in 3 distinct forms. First, whole berry form. Soak 1 cup of emmer berries overnight in 3 cups of water. Drain. Simmer in fresh water or broth for about 40 minutes until tender, with a little salt added in the last 10 minutes. Drain again. The result is a chewy, nutty, slightly springy grain that works as a base for salads, grain bowls, or as a side dish, much the way you would serve farro in a modern kitchen. 1 cup of cooked berries delivers roughly 7 to 8 grams of protein. Pair with lentils, chickpeas, or a small amount of feta or goat cheese for complete amino acid coverage. Second, as flour for bread. Mix emmer flour with water and sourdough starter at roughly 1 part active starter to 2 parts. Flour by weight. Add water to achieve a shaggy dough of about 70% hydration. Let ferment 8 to 12 hours at room temperature. Shape, proof, another 2 to 3 hours and bake at 450 degrees on a preheated stone for about 25 minutes. The loaf will be smaller and denser than a commercial white bread. That is correct. That is the point. Third, as a simple porridge. Coarsely ground or cracked emmer cooked slowly in milk or water with a pinch of salt, stirred occasionally for about 25 minutes, produces a thick, satisfying breakfast, similar to what Middle Eastern populations ate every morning for millennia. Add a little honey, a handful of chopped dates, or a spoon of olive oil and you have a meal that would be recognizable on any first-century table. A few more sourcing notes. Look for emmer explicitly on the label, not just farro or ancient grain. Reputable small grain mills across the United States, Italy, and Ethiopia ship authentic emmer berries and flour. Organic is preferable because modern pesticide residues can concentrate in whole grains. Whole berries store well for a year or more in a sealed container in a cool, dry place. Flour should be used within 3 months after milling because the oils in the germ begin to oxidize and go rancid. Many enthusiasts grind fresh. If you have a grain mill at home or a high-powered blender with a milling attachment, you can grind emmer flour in small batches as needed. The difference in taste is immediate and profound. Freshly milled emmer flour smells like warm hay and toasted nuts. Stale commercial flour smells like cardboard. Your nose will tell you everything. There is a larger point here about the design of plant foods in Scripture. The grains of the ancient Near East were not optimized for industrial processing. They were optimized for human nutrition. Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 7 describes the land Israel was being given as a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates. The grains are listed first, wheat meaning emmer, barley meaning the hulled grain still available today. These were the foundation of the daily table, and they were chosen not by industrialists chasing yield, but by generations of farmers and families paying attention to what kept their bodies strong. Scripture records the outcome. Modern laboratories are now filling in the mechanism, one named compound at a time. So here is your first step. Order 1 pound of whole emmer berries from a reputable source that names the species on the label. Cook a batch following the soak-simmer method. Serve it alongside a simple pot of lentils, a drizzle of good olive oil, and a sprinkle of salt. Notice how different the fullness feels compared to a meal built on modern wheat. Notice the slower, steadier energy across the afternoon. The way your appetite does not crash into sugar craving an hour later. If you find you respond to it the way many people do, consider moving it into weekly rotation, then daily. Keep a jar of berries and a bag of flour on hand. Rebuild a small piece of the ancient table in your own kitchen. Subscribe so you do not miss the next breakdown. We are covering the legumes of Scripture next, and specifically the lentil and emmer pairing that made a full plant protein meal centuries before anyone had a name for complete proteins. Until then, Thank you for investing this time. There is a grain that fed prophets and peasants alike, that sustained armies and fed children, that passed through the hands of the one who multiplied bread on a Galilean hillside and then broke it again in an upper room. It has not gone away. It just got quiet, crowded out by cheaper, softer, paler substitutes. And the body still remembers it. The body still knows exactly what to do with it.